John Rivers, a NASA astronaut, was slowly regaining consciousness. Every movement brought him unbearable pain. He felt something pressing on his chest, responding with a weight in every cell of his body. His mind was confused by dark memories of how everything went wrong. Their mission was a standard reconnaissance operation on a distant planet in the Omega system, but the ship crashed. He barely remembered how his comrades, screaming, disappeared into the chaos, torn apart by the blows of gravity and flashes of luminous lightning that struck the ship with unexpected force. Now he was here, alone, lying on the cold surface of an unknown planet. Opening his eyes, John saw the dark sky above him, crossed by strange purple lines like scars on the black skin of the night. Their color was almost hypnotic, but it was the sky of an alien world, a strange life, and perhaps death. John could feel the oxygen in his helmet running out. There are only a few minutes left before his lungs begin to contract in a panicked search for air. He tried to sit up, but his body refused to obey. Aches shot through his muscles, and every movement seemed slow, clumsy. The spacesuit, designed to protect him from extreme conditions, now became his prison, restricting movement and restricting access to air. John's eyes blurred and the world began to blur in front of him. A sharp pain in his chest, squeezing his ribs, told him that the end was near. There were only a few moments left, and that was it. At that moment, when the last sparks of consciousness began to fade, John felt a slight movement nearby. At first he thought it was a trick of his oxygen-deprived imagination, but then a light of a strange, non-earthly origin illuminated his dilapidated helmet. The silhouette, strange, tall, majestic, seemed to come out of the darkness, as if the night itself had parted in front of him. John couldn't make out the details, but this light enveloped the figure, as if imbuing it with energy unknown to him. And here she is, Lyra, the alien princess, bending over him, her face hidden under a hood that resembles a smooth, iridescent fabric, as if woven from starlight. Her movements were precise and confident, despite her distinct grace and lightness. John could barely make out her features, only the thin lines of her face, glowing with a violet echo. She resembled a translucent shadow that barely touched this world. Lyra didn't say. She just held out her hand, and a strange, soft energy radiated from the tips of her fingers, which felt more like warmth than light. John tried to say something, but his lips were dry and his voice broke. He could only watch silently as Lyra touched his body, introducing unknown technologies into his suit, whispering something in her own language. Her voice was barely audible, like the echo of distant stars. The soft light from her hands permeated the space around John, and he felt oxygen flowing back into his lungs. The cold that had been shackling his body began to recede, and his muscles gradually stopped resisting. Time seemed to slow down. Lyra's gaze lingered on his face, her eyes glowing in the semi-darkness, reflecting unfamiliar feelings. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps curiosity, but something inexplicable made her watch this stranger from a planet so far from her homeland. There was silence between them, broken only by the faint rustle of John's breathing, recovering from being on the brink of death. His body began to react slowly, his heart was beating more evenly, and the blood was flowing through his veins again. But now his attention was focused on Lyra, the strange creature that had saved him from death. She was in no hurry to speak, and John felt that. Despite her actions, her vague motives remained hidden beyond comprehension. He studied her gaze, trying to find answers in it, but met only a cold abyss that he could not solve. Her face showed no emotion, but inside John felt something deep, hidden, as if this meeting meant much more to her than just helping a stranger. Finally, Lyra raised her head, looking around. Her movements were fast and precise, like a predator's, but there was an extraordinary elegance in her gestures. It was as if she was trying to make sure that there was no danger around them. Her fingers lightly slid over his helmet, allowing fresh air to enter. Lyra took off her hood, and John could see her face. It was thin, almost fragile, with unusually bright eyes that carried a deep, unearthly wisdom. At that moment he realized that Lyra was not just a representative of another species, but perhaps the bearer of ancient secrets hidden on this mysterious planet. Gradually, John began to come to his senses, his mind regained clarity. He tried to sit up, but his body was still weak. Lyra gently helped him by touching his shoulder. Her hands seemed light but strong. John felt a strange connection between them, although he could not explain it in words. Her presence inspired both fear and confidence, fear of something unknown, of an alien world into which he had been dragged by force, and the certainty that she was here to help him.
Who are you?
John whispered faintly, his voice hoarse and weak, but still he dared to ask this question. Lyra didn't answer. She just looked at him for a long, searching moment, and then got to her feet. Her silhouette, illuminated by the dim light, loomed over John, as if she was trying to decide what to do next. She was far from him not only physically but also internally. This feeling of deep, inexplicable distance permeated their entire brief interaction. Lyra nodded slightly, as if saying goodbye, and began to walk away. However, John, feeling a new wave of fear, quickly reached out, clinging to her robe. His fingers barely touched the fabric, but it was enough for Lyra to stop. She froze for a moment, then slowly turned to him, her gaze stern but not hostile. That look said more than words could say. John understood whatever was driving Lyra, her intentions were not so obvious. She saved his life, but not for friendship or gratitude. A barrier remained between them, an insurmountable chasm of cultures, worlds, and destinies. But in that brief moment of contact, John felt that something had changed. Silence descended on the planet again, but now it was different. Lyra continued to stare at him, her expression softening, but she was still a mystery to John. He wanted to ask more, to find out what kind of forces had brought her here to him, but he knew that words were useless now. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she bent down to pick up his hand and gently put it back on the ground. Her gesture was both decisive and gentle, as if she wanted to remind him of her power but did not want to hurt him. John felt that his body was still too weak to resist, and his mind was filled with questions that seemed to have no answer. And yet there was a strange, silent bond between them, something that could not be expressed in words, but that both of them were aware of. John Rivers lay on the cold, sandy surface of the planet, barely recovering from a brief encounter with death. His body still felt heavy and painful, but the oxygen that filled his lungs again was the first step to salvation. Lyra, a mysterious alien, had already saved his life, but now John remained a prisoner of his thoughts, feelings, and unknown forces that surrounded him on this unfamiliar planet. Recovery was slow, as was his understanding of what had happened. Lyra stood nearby, her slender figure wrapped in a luminous mantle, seemed almost a part of this world, ancient and elusive. She was calm, her movements precise and graceful, as if they had all been calculated in advance. John couldn't take his eyes off her, even though his mind was still in a fog of questions and perplexity. Who is she? Why did you save him? What did she want from him? Her every action was like a scene from a dream too smooth to be real. She didn't seem to touch the ground, her steps were light, as if she was moving along invisible paths among the stars. Lyra bent over John and put her hands on his body again, and he felt the same strange wave of warmth and strength that brought him back to life. This time her touch was softer, more careful, but there was a confidence in it that he didn't have himself. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. Everything that was happening was beyond his comprehension, and even trying to express his gratitude seemed pointless. And did Lyra need it? Her gaze was focused, and her face remained impenetrable, like a creature living outside of emotional manifestations. John tried to sit up again, and Lyra, noticing his attempt, silently helped him. Her hands were cold, but their touch was strangely warming, as if she was transmitting her vital energy through them. When John finally settled into a sitting position, he felt the strange wind of the planet pass over his skin, even though he was still wearing a spacesuit. This wind was thick, as if the air here was saturated with unknown substances. In the distance, strange mountains could be seen that had no earthly analogues. Their peaks seemed to be chopped off and glowed with a faint flicker, as if the light came from the very depths of the planet. John looked around. There were only barren wastelands around, as if this world had dried up from time and left nothing but shadows behind. Lyra interrupted his thoughts by moving towards him. She took a few steps and was very close to him. He felt her presence, not only physically but also mentally. Her eyes, glowing with a soft bluish light, pierced him, as if trying to get to the very essence of his soul. Lyra didn't say anything, but there was something deep and ancient in that look. She understood what John was going through probably better than he was. Suddenly she touched his face. John flinched, not expecting this touch, but did not pull away. Her palm was cool, almost icy, but there was something unusually calm about it. At that moment, John realized that their bond was more than a simple salvation. He couldn't explain it in words, but he felt inside that something strange and deep had begun between them. Perhaps it was due to her telepathic abilities, or maybe it was due to that inexplicable energy that emanated from her body.
Who are you?
He whispered, not believing that his voice had broken through the barriers of internal tension. She didn't answer, but she smiled a little, a barely perceptible movement of the corners of her lips, which could be either a sign of understanding or a trick of John's imagination. Her eyes flashed for a moment, and suddenly he heard her voice not from outside but inside his head. This voice was soft, soothing, like the rustle of the wind in the distant forests of Earth, although he had never heard anything like it.
Lyra.
Sounded in his mind.
I'm Lyra.
The name was short, simple, but it resonated in his head with an extraordinary depth. There was something elusive about the word, as if it contained the history of an ancient race that no longer existed on this planet. Lyra didn't say any more, and John didn't insist. He just nodded, trying to accept her extraordinary presence, her way of communicating. It was strange, but John understood that a lot of things in this world would seem strange to him until he got used to it. Lyra started moving again, motioning for him to follow her. She didn't say a word, but her movement was clear enough she had to go forward. John, although still feeling weak, began to slowly get to his feet. He managed to get up only thanks to her help, but after a few minutes he felt his strength returning to him. He looked around, struck again by the extraterrestrial beauty of this world, and followed Lyra. They walked in silence. Lyra wasn't looking at him, completely focused on guiding him through the desolate landscapes of this planet. John tried to walk steadily, although every step was difficult as if his body was resisting the gravity of this world. He watched Lyra move ahead of him. Her movements were smooth, light, as if she belonged to this world, and he was an outsider here, unable even to stand on his feet without her help. In the distance, the outlines of something similar to a building appeared. John narrowed his eyes, trying to get a better look at what it was. It looked like some kind of old ruin, an ancient structure, dilapidated, but still majestic. Its peaks were covered with moss or something similar, and a faint glow emanated from the depths of the stone blocks. They were heading there, and John felt something flutter inside his heart, not fear, but rather curiosity. They got closer, and John could see in more detail. The structure was clearly man-made, although, judging by its appearance, it had existed here for centuries, if not millennia. The stone slabs were carved with strange symbols that John had never seen before. They glowed with a soft purple light and seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. These symbols were not just signs there was something alive in them, something that seemed familiar to him, although he could not understand why. Lyra passed her hand over one of the symbols, and John saw the light increase. The building seemed to come to life under her touch. The walls began to vibrate slowly, and the air around them was filled with a strange energy. John felt this energy permeate him, as every nerve in his body began to respond to the presence of this force. He found it difficult to breathe, but Lyra seemed completely calm. Her movements were precise and confident, as if she knew what she was doing.
Is it safe?
John muttered, trying to calm his own fear of the unknown. Lyra turned her head slightly, but did not answer. Instead, she took a step forward and touched the second symbol. At the same moment, the wall in front of them began to slowly move apart, opening a path inside the building. John felt the cold wind hit him in the face, and at the same time a strange feeling of calmness came over him. It seemed that this place was more than just a ruin. It held secrets that John couldn't even imagine. Lyra entered first, her figure quickly disappearing into the semi-darkness of the building. John followed her, feeling the darkness envelop him. It was cool inside, but the air was surprisingly clean. The walls glowed with the same purple light, illuminating the way. John followed Lyra, and his every move echoed in the empty corridors. This place seemed abandoned, but there was something alive in it, as if it was waiting for something or someone. Lyra stopped in the center of the great hall, where the light was brighter. She turned to John, and their eyes met again. This time there was more warmth in her eyes, more human understanding. John stood in front of her, feeling strangely out of place in this ancient place, but now he knew they were here for a reason. The silence of the ancient hall turned out to be deceptive. Inside these walls, filled with a soft purple light, there was a mystery, but also a threat. Lyra stopped in the center of the room, her eyes glittering in the light of the strange symbols on the walls. John's gaze was fixed on her figure, but worry was growing inside him. He felt that they were being watched, that this place, no matter how calm it seemed at first glance, hid much more than one could imagine. Suddenly, Lyra turned around. Her face became serious, even tense. John immediately realized that something had changed, something was threatening them. Her movements became faster, more precise, and she motioned for him to follow her again. As soon as John took a step, the hall was filled with a vibration, quiet, but palpable, as if the building itself was responding to the presence of outsiders. The walls seemed to move, and the air around them became heavier. Lyra glanced sharply at John, and he caught an expression on her face that he had not seen before: anxiety. She came closer, quickly and silently grabbed his hand. Her touch was cold but strong. She pulled him along, and John, suppressing his inner fear, followed her. He didn't know what was going on, but his intuition told him that doing nothing here would be a fatal mistake. Lyra led him through the corridors of the ruin, turning left and right, as if she knew the way by heart. The stone walls, illuminated by glowing symbols, seemed to have a life of their own. The light, which seemed calm, began to pulse faster, becoming alarming. It seemed that the building was beginning to awaken, but not to protect them, but rather to trap them. John felt the vibration increase, as if the walls were breathing, approaching them. He glanced at Lyra, hoping for answers, but her face remained focused. She led him further and deeper into the maze of these corridors. John was breathing heavily. Every step was painful in his body. The effects of the shipwreck and the recent rescue were still taking their toll. But he had no choice. He couldn't afford to stop. And so an exit light appeared ahead. Lyra pointed to a narrow crevice in the wall through which a bright light was pouring from outside. She pushed him forward. John hesitated a little, squeezed into this narrow passage, and they found themselves in the open air. Outside, under the bright but cold light of an alien star, a new picture opened up. They were surrounded by an endless plain intersected by strange peaks of mountains, but none of these places gave a sense of security. Lyra stopped, and John froze too, trying to catch his breath. He looked at her and seemed to see some confusion in her eyes, but it only lasted for a split second. She knew what to do, but she knew that there was little time left. John heard a rustle behind him, faint but clear, like the sound of footsteps, many footsteps. Lyra quickly turned her head towards the sound and then looked back at John. Her gaze was eloquent, despite the lack of words. They were being chased. Now he realized that they weren't just running, someone was following them. Lyra was not alone in this world. Someone knew she was here, someone was looking for her, and John was just a random part of this equation that Lyra had to solve. She grabbed his arm again and they ran. John struggled to keep up the rhythm, even though his legs were buckling and his breathing was becoming more and more ragged. The wind seemed to come suddenly cold and sharp, as if the very air on this planet was against them. Lyra led him across the plain, dodging large boulders and small caves, as if she knew the landscape down to the smallest detail. John tried to concentrate, but his thoughts kept returning to the fact that he did not understand the whole picture. Who's following them? Why are they hunting Lyra? He knew that now was not the time to ask questions, but the unknown was weighing on his mind by the minute. They reached a rocky ledge, and Lyra paused for a moment to assess the situation. She looked down at the narrow path leading to an array of rocks hidden in the shadows. It was the only direction where they might not be noticed, but the path looked dangerous, narrow, and slippery. John looked at her and read a warning in her gaze, but there was no other way out. Lyra was the first to step onto the path, her movements fast and confident. John could barely keep his feet as he followed her. The stones slipped down under her feet. Every step was risky, but Lyra moved as if she had been born here. Her steps were precise, as if she knew every crack in this rock. John tried to follow her movements, trying not to look down, but his body struggled with the feeling of losing its balance. Suddenly, a sound came from behind the rocks like the rumble of distant thunder. But John realized that it was not a natural noise. Lyra stopped and turned to him. There was tension in her eyes. Their pursuers were closer than she expected. She pointed to the path ahead again, and John, gathering all his strength, began to move faster. His heart was beating so hard that it seemed like it was going to jump out of his chest. But Lyra did not lose her composure. Her face, although reflecting tension, remained focused. They reached a narrow passage between the rocks, hidden from prying eyes. Lyra made a sign to stop and listened. John, breathing heavily, tried to calm the air rushing out of his chest, but his heart was pounding like crazy. In the distance, outside their hiding place, he heard the sounds of footsteps getting closer and closer. It became clear to him that their pursuers would not retreat. Whoever it is, they won't stop until they find Lyra. Lyra, listening to the sounds, gently touched his arm, as if trying to calm him down. Her touch momentarily distracted John from his fear, and he felt strangely confident. Her presence was not only physical, but also somehow mental, as if she could convey to him her calmness, her determination. She was his guide in this strange world, and it was only because of her that he was still alive. The footsteps were getting closer. John heard a hum of voices, unintelligible but hostile. Their pursuers were here, and there was less and less time. Lyra slowly led him deeper into the narrow passage between the rocks, trying to move as quietly as possible. She knew that if they were discovered, there would be no turning back. And so silence descended on them again. The footsteps stopped, the voices disappeared, but the tension remained. John listened, trying to catch at least some sound, but everything was as quiet as in the void. Lyra stopped, and leaning against a stone, carefully examined the surroundings. Her eyes sparkled in the dim light of an alien star. They were in a kind of cave hidden deep in the rocks. and John felt that it was a temporary shelter but not salvation. Their breathing was the only sound that broke the lingering silence. Lyra looked at John again. Her face was calm, but her gaze spoke volumes. They couldn't stay here for long. John nodded slowly, making it clear that he understood. He felt that they were now bound by the same fate, and that their lives depended on each next step. Lyra took a deep breath and moved forward again, leading him out of this narrow hiding place. When they got out into the open, the sun was starting to set on the horizon, flooding the plain with a blood-red light. This light cast long shadows, and John felt that night on this planet could be even more dangerous than day. Lyra, without stopping, led him to the distant cliffs on the horizon, where shadows could hide them from the eyes of their pursuers. They moved quickly, but carefully, trying not to attract attention. It was only when darkness completely enveloped this alien world that Lyra slowed down. The night on an alien planet came quickly and suddenly. The dazzling sunset light was swallowed up by instant darkness, and the whole world was plunged into a deep, almost tangible darkness. The landscape that was in front of them a moment ago disappeared as if it did not exist. The shadows that had been playing on Earth had merged together, and only the faintly glowing lines in the sky reminded them that they were still on this strange planet. Lyra slowed her steps, looking back at John. Their journey through the rocky terrain was grueling, but he felt that the pursuers had fallen behind. Nevertheless, the tension in the air did not subside, as if the planet itself was watching them from the darkness. A hurricane of thoughts and sensations raged inside John. His mind was overloaded with the events of the last day, and his body seemed exhausted to the limit. He didn't know how long he could keep going, but he knew he couldn't stop. They reached a small cave hidden among the rocks. Lyra entered first, checking the shelter, then motioned for John to follow her. It was cramped and cool inside, but safe at least for now. He stopped, leaning against the wall, his breathing slow and deep to calm the storm in his chest. The silence that reigned around was deafening. There was no sound of wind, birdsong, or rustling leaves. Only a faint, almost imperceptible echo of their own movements echoed in the narrow space of the cave. John, gradually calming down, looked around. The walls were rough, dotted with natural cracks, through which the faint light of alien stars barely penetrated. Lyra was standing at the entrance, her figure barely visible against the darkness. She did not move, as if she had turned into a statue, merging with the environment. But even so, there was tension in her stillness, like a taut string ready to break at any moment. John stared at her, trying to figure out exactly what was connecting them at that moment. She saved his life. She brought him here, to this shelter. And yet there was a gap between them that he couldn't understand. He sat down on the ground, leaning against the cold wall of the cave, and closed his eyes. Thoughts whirled through his head, but one of them wouldn't let him rest. What did Lyra see in him? Why had she saved him, an outsider who had nothing to do with her world? John was neither a hero nor a chosen one. He was just one of many who went to explore distant worlds. But this meeting with Lyra changed everything. Now he couldn't just go back, couldn't ignore her presence in his life. He could feel her silent presence beside him. Lyra stood at the entrance to the cave, listening to the world around her. Her face remained mysterious, her eyes did not reflect any emotions, but John knew that something was going on inside her. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she sometimes held her breath, as if listening to something invisible beyond his comprehension. The night continued to fall deeper and deeper, and the world around them became completely silent. The cave now seemed like a place where time had stopped. Lyra finally moved away from the entrance and came closer to him. She sat down opposite him, her movements smooth and silent, like a creature accustomed to the dark. Their eyes met, and at that moment John felt something he had never felt before. It wasn't just curiosity or gratitude. There was an invisible connection between them, something that did not require words. He couldn't explain it logically, but he knew that their fates were now intertwined. Lyra felt it too. There was something new in her gaze, perhaps fatigue, perhaps relief, but definitely something human. She was no longer just a mysterious princess from a distant world to him. Her face no longer seemed like an impenetrable mask. At that moment, John realized that there was more going on between them than just a fight for survival. It was something deeply personal. Lyra wasn't just his savior. She was a being who was struggling with her inner demons, just like him. John felt that a conflict was raging inside her, which she carefully hid. And now, in this cave, on the verge of life and death, she allowed herself to relax a little. He stared at her, trying to figure out what was behind her eyes. Lyra, sensing his gaze, did not look away, but her face remained calm. And yet, in that silence, a spark lit up between them. It was not instantaneous or vivid, as in romantic stories, but rather like a smoldering flame that is about to ignite. Something had changed inside John. He felt his own fears and doubts begin to recede before this strange but unshakable sense of connection. He didn't have to say anything, and he knew that Lyra wouldn't say a word either. But everything was clear. Their hearts, their souls, began to speak in a language that needed no words. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing: whatever lay ahead, they would get through it together. This thought gave him strength in a strange way. Despite his fatigue, despite the pain, he felt ready to keep going. It doesn't matter what dangers await them outside this cave. Lyra, apparently sensing this change in him, tilted her head slightly. It was an almost imperceptible movement, but John realized that she also felt this connection. She didn't need to explain anything to him. Everything was obvious in the way she looked at him, the way her eyes glowed faintly in the semi-darkness. They were two beings from different worlds, but at that moment they became one. Their feelings, their emotions were intertwined, and it was impossible to ignore it. The night outside the cave was deep and frightening, but there was a light inside them. This light was barely noticeable, but it was warm, almost warming. John couldn't tell exactly what it was, but he knew he wasn't afraid anymore. Lyra was there, and it gave him confidence. Their silent dialogue continued all night. They didn't need words to understand each other. Every movement, every look, said more than their voices could express. Lyra, although she remained outwardly calm, seemed less detached inside. John could feel her fears, her struggles, but also her determination. And he realized that they were no longer just companions in misfortune. They have become something more to each other. Gradually, the night deepened, and the world outside the cave froze in complete darkness. Time seemed to cease to exist, and they were left alone, surrounded by silence and emptiness. John couldn't tell exactly how much time had passed. He could only feel this moment, the moment when two lonelies found each other in the midst of an endless universe. His thoughts went back to their first encounter, to the moment when Lyra had saved his life. At the time, he didn't understand why she did it, but now everything has become clear. She saw something in him that he hadn't noticed for a long time: the strength to fight despite his despair. Perhaps she saw her reflection in him, and that was what connected them. When the first rays of a distant star began to penetrate into the cave, John felt fatigue gradually creeping over him, but at the same time a sense of calmness came. Lyra, noticing his condition, nodded slightly, as if allowing him to rest. He closed his eyes, knowing that she would be on guard. And although his mind was still full of questions, in that moment all that mattered was here, in this silent understanding that they shared. John fell asleep, feeling Lyra's light touch on his arm, and this subtle connection between them, like an invisible thread, remained even in a dream. The night had given way to a new day, but the light of a distant star, barely touching the cave, seemed dim and cold. John was awakened by a slight noise outside their hiding place. His mind, still struggling with the remnants of sleep, instantly returned to reality. Everything that had happened in the last 24 hours seemed unreal, but the fact remained that he was still on this alien planet, along with Lyra, hiding them both from unknown pursuers. He got up slowly, so as not to disturb the silence. Lyra was already standing at the entrance to the cave, her figure barely standing out against the dim light. She looked as composed as she had the day before, but there was tension in her posture. Her body was ready for the inevitable events that she had clearly foreseen. John felt it. They couldn't stay safe anymore, the time had come. Lyra seemed to sense the approach of something inevitable. Her shoulders were slightly slumped, but her attention was focused on the outside world. John knew she was hearing or feeling something he didn't know. Maybe her pursuers were closer than he'd thought. Maybe danger was waiting for them right outside this cave. He didn't know, but he could feel her coming. They had to move on without staying in one place for too long. Their escape the day before had given them temporary shelter, but it was temporary. Lyra was well aware of this, and John was beginning to realize that their path was not just an escape from random enemies. The planet itself seemed to be set against them. As soon as they left the cave, a cold wind hit them in the face. It was sharp and penetrating, reminding of the harshness of this planet that did not tolerate weakness. The ground beneath their feet was hard, like long-cooled lava, covered with a thin layer of dust. Everything seemed lifeless, even the sky looked empty, devoid of the depth that John knew on Earth. But behind that emptiness there was danger, invisible but clear, like a shadow following them from the very beginning. Lyra continued to move forward, her steps light and precise as always. She did not look back at John, but he felt her inner connection with him, the subtle understanding they had gained during the night. Now that he was following her, he felt not only grateful for his rescue, but also a desire to protect her, even if it seemed impossible. Lyra was a distant being, mysterious and powerful, but she was just as vulnerable as he was. The further they got away from the cave, the more John began to realize that this planet would not let them go just like that. He could feel her beneath him, feel her watching, waiting. Every step echoed in the ground, as if they were breaking some long-standing harmony. Lyra continued to lead him through plains, slopes, and gorges, but each new section of the path seemed even more hostile than the previous one. And so when the sun rose high above the horizon, everything changed. John felt the air around him suddenly become dense, saturated with a strange energy. Everything froze. Lyra stopped abruptly, her body tensing as if she felt the same threat as John. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate slightly, as if warning them of impending disaster. Ahead, behind a small hill, a shadow appeared, at first small, barely discernible, but it quickly began to grow. Lyra clenched her hands into fists, her eyes became cold and focused. She already knew what kind of shadows they were, and John, although he had not seen them before, instinctively realized that these were the ones who had been chasing them all this way. He looked around, trying to find cover, but there was only open ground around them. The rocky outcroppings that could have given them at least minimal protection were too far away. There was no time. Lyra had already assessed the situation and started moving faster, but John felt that their chances were minimal. The shadows were getting closer. Now their shapes could be discerned, tall, graceful, but menacing figures surrounded by thin energy shields that shimmered in the light of an alien star. These creatures seemed to blend into the landscape, their movements smooth but full of hidden aggression. They followed them, taking their time, knowing that their prey would not be able to get far. Lyra suddenly stopped. John looked at her, not understanding why she had stopped running. Her face remained unreadable, but a desperate determination appeared in her eyes. She wasn't going to run anymore. She understood that this was the end of their journey, that this meeting was inevitable. John wanted to take a step towards her, but at the same moment he realized that Lyra was going to do something that would change everything. Lyra began to move slowly, her arms lifted slightly, and John felt the air around them begin to thicken. The ground trembled underfoot again, but this time the vibration came from Lyra herself. Her energy, which she had been hiding all this time, began to awaken. John saw invisible forces swirling around her, her luminous aura growing stronger with every passing moment. He realized that Lyra was going to fight. But something in her movements, in her concentration, made John freeze in place. He realized this is not just a struggle for survival, it was a sacrifice. Lyra was preparing to do something irreversible that could save him, but not her. The figures chasing them approached. They stopped some distance away, as if studying their target. Their faces were hidden behind their helmets, but John could sense the cold calculation in their actions. They came for Lyra. And they knew she could resist. Lyra took a step forward, her body began to glow brighter than before. Her movements became smooth and almost graceful, despite the danger. She raised her arms and the air swirled around her. John saw the energy begin to gather in her palms, becoming brighter and brighter. He didn't know what she was going to do, but he felt that her power surpassed anything he had seen up to this point. The earth began to crack under her feet, the air became thick and heavy, as if the planet itself was responding to her call. Lyra concentrated, her face remained calm, but there was something tragic in that calmness. She has already made her choice. The shadows standing in front of them suddenly rushed forward, but at the same moment Lyra raised her arms higher, and a flash of light blinded John. He squeezed his eyes shut, but even through his closed eyelids he could feel the incredible power emanating from Lyra. When he opened his eyes, the world around him changed. The whole area they were in became as if alive stones rose into the air, the soil was torn apart, and the space around Lyra sparkled with energy. The figures approaching them stopped. Their shields began to flicker, weakening under the power emanating from Lyra. Her powers knew no bounds. John felt like she was giving everything she had to protect him, and that realization was excruciating. He was aware that she was sacrificing herself for him so that he could leave. And so Lyra exploded with a burst of energy. Blinding light flooded everything around him, and John felt his body rising into the air. At that moment he lost control of what was happening. Everything was gone, the shadows, the earth, and time itself. He felt only cold light and emptiness. As the light began to fade, John fell to the ground. His body was emaciated but alive. He lay on the cold surface, trying to figure out what had happened. There was only ashes, rocks, and ruined earth around him. The shadows were gone. They were gone. But Lyra wasn't there either. John felt something snap inside him. When the light finally faded and John felt the firmness under his feet again, his mind was still in chaos. Lyra disappeared, and he was left alone on this alien planet, where every particle of air and every stone seemed hostile. The feeling of emptiness was so strong that he lost his sense of reality for a moment. The world around him seemed to be an illusion created by unfathomable forces that seemed to be playing with his fate. The ground he was lying on was ravaged by a flash of power that Lyra used at the last moment. Everything around bore signs of destruction. Rocks were torn to pieces, dust swirled in the air, and strange, almost invisible to the eye energy remnants whirled around him. It seemed as if the whole area, once covered with dead silence, had been enlivened by one last flash of her power. John got up slowly. His body was exhausted to the limit. Every muscle burned with tension. Every movement was difficult. And yet he felt the life within him, the very life that Lyra had saved for him by sacrificing herself. The realization of this penetrated to the very depths of his being like a cold, piercing wind, leaving bitterness and emptiness. He stood among the ruins of her last exploit, but he knew that from that moment on his life would never be the same. He looked around, hoping to see something that might give him an explanation. But there was only emptiness around, no trace of shadow, no trace of Lyra. All that reminded me of her was this ruined landscape and the remnants of her energy that were still in the air. At first, John thought that he had lost her forever, but something inside him, some tiny hope, told him that this was not the end. Suddenly, John felt a strange warmth inside him. It wasn't physical, rather, it was an inner feeling as if his soul had come into contact with something higher than himself. This connection with Lyra, which they had established in a short time, did not disappear along with her physical body. She stayed with him, permeating his being like a living fire, warming him on the coldest night. Lyra was no longer around in the usual sense, but her energy, her spirit, became a part of him. She was with him, somewhere deep inside. Gathering his last strength, John began to move. He didn't know where to go, but his intuition, that very connection with Lyra, seemed to guide him forward. Every step was difficult, but he felt it was the right thing to do. In front of him stretched a vast plain, veiled by a haze from the distant horizon, and he walked, although his body resisted. Hours, days, time no longer mattered. John walked, driven by only one desire to understand what had happened to him and what to do next. The planet no longer seemed as hostile to him as it had before. He could feel her rhythm, her pulse, as if she was no longer just his temporary place of residence, but part of his new destiny. He was no longer an outsider. After Lyra gave him her power, he began to feel the world around him in a new way. Gradually, the plain began to give way to hills, and then rare plants appeared, reaching for the light of a distant star. The landscape was still harsh, but John could feel the life in it now. The planet was alive, it was just hiding its secrets deep below the surface. A feeling awoke inside him that he had become a part of this life, that now his fate was inextricably linked with this earth, with these heavens. He walked non-stop, but his footsteps were no longer filled with anxiety. He did not know where his path would lead, but he realized that this path belonged to him alone. Lyra showed him something more than just a struggle for survival. She revealed to him the depths of a world that stretched far beyond his previous understanding. Now he was ready to accept it, ready for a new life, even if its beginning was tinged with loss. It took several days before John reached the old city, destroyed by time and abandoned by the inhabitants many centuries ago. He was majestic. Despite his devastation, the high stone walls that once protected the inhabitants now lay in ruins, but their grandeur could still be felt. Columns and arches that had resisted the winds of time went up into the sky like the ghosts of a past civilization. John entered the city, feeling the old energies of the place permeate him. It seemed to him that there had once been great powers here, perhaps even the same as Lyra's. He walked slowly, taking his time, breathing in the antiquity of this place. Here, among the ruins, he felt at home, as if this place had become his home. The old town was empty, but there was something alive in the air. John stopped in the main square, looking around. In the center of the square stood a massive statue made of a material he couldn't recognize. The statue depicted a lyre-like creature, tall, graceful, with graceful features. Perhaps it was one of her ancestors. Perhaps this place was the homeland of her people. John ran his hand over the statue, feeling its cold surface, but at the same time felt the warmth inside himself. Lyra was still with him. She hadn't left him completely, and that realization filled him with strength. In this city, he felt he could start all over again. He was ready to stay here, although his mind still did not fully understand what this place was and why it attracted him. It's been a few weeks. John settled into one of the old buildings. which, although destroyed by time, still retained its walls. He began to study the old technologies left behind by this ancient civilization, trying to figure out how to use them. Over time, he managed to activate several artifacts, and they began to glow with a familiar purple light, the same light that was part of Lyra. Now, John had time to think. He realized that his life on Earth had long been left behind. The memories of his former life began to seem distant, almost alien. His connection with Lyra and her sacrifice changed him forever. He was no longer a man in the usual sense. His essence was intertwined with something much bigger, ancient, and deep. John decided to stay in this city. He knew that this was his home now. His old life was part of another world, far away and impossible to return to. Here, among the ruins and traces of an ancient civilization, he began a new existence. His days passed in search of answers to the questions that continued to torment him, but at the same time, he felt a peace and harmony that he had not known before. The planet that seemed hostile and frightening to him became his home. He learned to understand her rhythm, her strength. John began to feel that Lyra had given him not only salvation but also the opportunity to become something more than he was. Her sacrifice had opened the door to a new life for him, and now he was ready to go through it. It was a long time before John saw new faces. One day, figures appeared on the horizon. They were walking towards the old town, just as he had once walked. They were strangers like himself, but John was no longer an outsider. He became a part of this planet, and this planet became a part of him. Now he was the one who welcomed the guests, the one who could guide them through the trials he had faced himself. His new life didn't start the way he expected. It was full of surprises, losses, and discoveries. But now John knew that everything that had happened made sense. Lyra, her sacrifice and her power had changed his fate forever. And even though she was no longer physically around, her presence always stayed with him, guiding and protecting him. This new life was full of mysteries, but John was ready to solve them. Now he knew that whatever lay ahead of him, he could handle it. After all, Lyra had left a part of herself in his soul forever.